This job was a pain from the start. The customer was pushy, giving Captain Sunlight a run for her money on the diplomacy front. Not bad enough for us to refuse to make the delivery, but pushing the boundaries. And the cargo was awkward. And since it was animals, that was my problem. "Keep your distance," I told Z. "I think he can get his beak between the bars." The cage was large and rickety, with bars a few inches apart. As if to prove me right, a long furry neck with a beak at the end stabbed outward and hissed at us. Z flared his pincher arms and hissed back, but the creature wasn't impressed. It just spread its bat-like wings as far as the cage would allow, and made a surprisingly deep honk that echoed through the cargo bay. I hadn't read the documents yet about what kind of animal this was, from which planet, but if those documents turned out to say this was a genetic experiment in unwise combinations, I wouldn't have been a bit surprised. It was vaguely goose-shaped, just with 4 feet instead of 2, equipped with talons instead of webs, white fur instead of feathers, and a beak that ended in a wickedly sharp hook. After all the hawks and parrots I'd encountered back on Earth, that beak looked ready for either mischief or violence. Probably both. At any rate, the goose thing's honk set off the tiny creatures in the other cage, which thankfully were better contained. That cage was a mesh sphere not about to let any of the little drifting dust motes out. As enchanting as it might be to have the spaceship filled with colourful bits of fluff that moved gracefully and made a chorus of tiny peeps, they just looked like allergies waiting to happen. And I didn't want to think about finding them behind the wall panels later. Z hissed at the furry demon goose again, clearly hoping to frighten it into submission. No luck. "Knock it off," I told him. "That'll just make it louder. Here, help me get the lifter under the cage." The customer had brought the cage on board for us, but this wasn't a good spot for it, so it was up to me, the resident animal expert, to get it moved safely to a room more suited to animal cargo. Nobody wanted to sneak past this biter to get to the rest of the crates. Luckily, we had a freshly refurbished hover sled with a lifting scoop that could slide under anything as long as the thing in question held still. I convinced Z to hold the cage stationary, since his exoskeleton was tougher than my fingers. The goose thing pecked at him from an awkward angle. I worked the controls, and soon our misbehaving cargo was lifted up onto the sled. I looked over at the round cage full of chirping alien pixies. Let's come back for that one. Agreed. The goose was quiet while we moved it down the hall, taking in the sights with all the attention of someone casing the joint. I told myself not to be too judgmental. Maybe it had never been on the spaceship before, and was curious. Then Blip walked out of a side corridor, wearing her favourite flowy silk outfit that made her look like a muscly flower, and no, the goose was just looking for opportunities. It snapped at the nearest hem and almost got a beakful, but Blip moved just in time. Then she scolded it for almost ripping quality Fullian clothes. "Do you know how hard this is to replace? Of course you don't. You're a rude animal." She shook a blue finger at the unrepentant goose. Behind her, Blop appeared and aimed his own frown into the cage. "Sorry," I said. "Don't get too close to this one. At least it was only aiming for your clothes, not something that would bleed." Blip folded muscular arms, flaring her frills, and scowled. "It would have regretted that." I sighed, pushing the hover sled forward. Don't punch the cargo. Blip muttered as we left. There were no further incidents on the way into storage hold B, and the goose didn't even try to bite us as we got the cage off the sled. It was busy inspecting the view, boxes, cabinets, and the large clear containment pen that had held troublemaking cargo before. It would have been nice to shove this guy in there, but the cage wouldn't fit through the door, and there was no way I was going to voluntarily let it out. "I'm watching you," I told it, as I followed Z back into the hall. Technically, Kavle was watching, or maybe Weo. Whoever was in the cockpit behind the security cameras. They'd be making sure the onboarding process went smoothly before the ship took off. I knew that, but I was still surprised to hear Kavle's voice on the hallway intercom a few minutes later. "Walk faster," she said from a single speaker. "It's trying to open a box." "It can reach that?" I asked, pushing the hover sled more quickly. The aura pass squeaked and twirled. Their cage had a label with a species description and the number of creatures inside. They were behaving. Z scurried ahead on his many bug legs to open the door. Before I could get there, he charged inside, hissing again. I heard answering hisses and the sound of a crate being scraped across the floor. Once I got the aura pass into the room, I found Z inspecting a gnawed-on box corner with splinters on the floor. The goose looked pleased with itself. I asked, "What's the damage?" "Nothing significant," Z said. "Luckily this is our own ship's supplies, not something for a client." "Yeah, that wouldn't look good." I parked the sled. "Here's your delivery. You don't mind a little artistic nibbling about the edges, do you? I'm sure that would go over well." Z shoved a couple other boxes further back and helped me set the aura pass a safe distance away. Then, under Cavalier's watchful eye, we went back to the cargo bay for some non-animal cargo. The intercom chimed before we got there. "It's trying to pick the lock in its cage," Cavalier said, still on single speaker mode. "I don't know if it's oh no, it's out." I left the sled in the middle of the hallway and ran, with Z right behind me. Speakers all along the hall chorused, "It opened the other cage." I said a very unprofessional word and charged forward to slam my hand on the door opening panel. Expecting the one cargo to be actively eating the other, I dashed inside, only to be knocked off my feet by the goose making a break for it. I fell amid clouds of happily chirping aurapass. Z lunged for the goose, but it dodged what would have been a very painful hug from his pincher arms, and I heard it honking triumphantly down the hall. Z ran after it while the whole ship intercom chimed. "Escape cargo, it is large and likes to bite. Currently heading towards the crew lounge. Captain, permission to use stun guns on the cargo?" After a moment, Captain Sunlight answered from somewhere else on the ship. "Permission granted. All available crew, arm yourselves and proceed with caution. Cavalier, keep us posted on its whereabouts." Trying not to feel like a failure, I scrambled to my feet and checked a cabinet for stun guns. Found one. Waving the aura pass away from the door, I regretfully let them floating about the storage hold, while I chased after the bigger problem. Z had already disappeared. I met Trilly in the hall. "How dangerous is this animal?" she asked, looming over me and flexing her pincher arms in delight. "I don't think it wants to seriously hurt anyone, but I can't say for sure," I said. "It might go for the eyes if it's cornered. Try not to damage it." "Frightening causes no damage," Trilly said, and flashed away down the hall. I ran after. Cavalier reported, "It's in the crew lounge, searching the furniture, probably looking for food. This could be a good place to corner it." Trilly waited in position outside the lounge when I arrived, crouched like a spider ready to spring. Z was moving toward the kitchen entrance to flank it. A flash of yellow scales at the other end of the hall was Captain Sunlight, hurrying forward with a stun gun aimed at the floor. The goose made a muffled honk from inside the lounge, crunching something that sounded like snack food scavenged from under the couch. I stopped behind Trilly and waited for everyone to get into position. 2 threatening predators and 2 stun guns ought to be a recipe for success against one alien goose. Then the goose dashed into the kitchen before Z could get there, and the whole plan went out the window. Trilly raced after it. Z got in the captain's way. I reached the kitchen in time to see the creature hiss in defiance before prying open a cabinet door. It might have thought that was an exit. In reality, it was Pain's hiding spot, and she shrieked, fit to shatter eardrums, curling into a ball of scales and panic. That was enough of a distraction for Mimi to drop from the high shelf he'd been waiting on, and wrap the demon goose in all of his tentacles. It was surprisingly effective. That's not the plan, but I'll take it. Everyone was shouting and in the way. I followed Mimi's example and climbed onto a counter, where I could get a clear shot for the stun gun and not hit him. I stunned the goose in the butt, and it finally stopped flapping. It took a while for all the yelling to subside, but the captain wriggled past Z and Trilly to declare no harm done. Cavalier told the rest of the ship. Mimi untangled himself from the goose, who had frozen in an inconvenient position. Pain stayed in the cabinet. Z clicked away to get the hover sled, then stopped when Trilly simply dragged the goose toward the hold. Captain Sunlight looked up at me. Good shot. Thanks, I said, getting down from the counter. I'd have to wash the footprints off that later. Paint? It's safe to come out? Mimi was already coaxing her out of the cabinet, offering some of the snacks that she'd apparently been eating, when she heard the alert about the dangerous animal. Speaking of which, I thought. With paint in good hands, or the equivalent, I hurried after the others. I heard Captain Sunlight say a few words to Paint and Mimi before following. So we got to put the goose in the clear pen for naughty animals after all. This pen didn't have anywhere it could stick its beak out of once the stun wore off, only mesh-covered air vents way at the top, and a door that locked, very reliably, from the outside. Take that, you troublemaker. We caught the aura puffs carefully by hand, or the equivalent, and put them back in their own cage. Thankfully, the goose hadn't damaged the latch, just opened it with bird-brained cleverness. It's just those last two left, Captain Sunlight said, after counting. Up there! The two in question were floating higher than her little lizardly arms could reach, so I moved to do the honours. As I did, Blip and Blop arrived with the bug-catching net that no one had been able to find earlier. They also brought with them a feline blur that I caught mid-leap, just before Telly snatched an aura puff out of the air. Not for you, I said, heart beating wildly. Let's get you some proper cat treats that don't belong to a paying customer. Blip and Blop exclaimed loudly at Telly's speed, my reaction time, and the fact that they'd had no idea she was there. They were sorry they almost got the cargo eaten. Captain Sunlight repeated, "No harm done." She waved me off to my quarters with the disgruntled cat, and spoke to the others about plans to notify the customer of just what kind of danger fee he'd brought upon himself by not properly securing his chaos-causing animal.